The letter had been folded so many times its creases had softened like cloth. Clara May Jenkins kept it pressed between her fingers, even as the train rocked hard across a ridge. The ink had faded a little, but she'd memorized every line. A man named Thomas Reed, 41, no children, widowed, had written kindly, with neat loops and respectful phrases. He'd said she sounded like the kind of woman who made a house a home. He'd even written that a limp didn't scare him, that he wanted character, not perfection. She'd read that part 3 times a night for a month. Now, hours from arriving, she stared out the window at the hills stitched with fences and trees, her thoughts louder than the tracks. She wore her best dress, gray wool modest buttons, hemmed just long enough to cover her left boot, which was built a half-inch taller than the right. Her cane rested against her leg, carved from hickory and sanded smooth by her own hands. The handle had a small dent from where her father's belt had once struck it in a fit of frustration. She'd kept that dent, like she kept everything, quietly, stubbornly, without fuss. The train slowed. Steam hissed. The sky was pale gold, just past dawn, and the station came into view like a breath held too long. She stepped off carefully, suitcase in one hand, cane in the other. No one rushed to meet her. No name on a placard, no smile in the crowd. Just a few townsfolk gathering parcels, a boy dragging a wooden crate, a woman selling bread from a basket that steamed in the cold. Then she saw him, Thomas Reed, tall and broad, with a gray coat and a hat pulled low. He looked just like his photograph, only older, more tired around the eyes. He stood still, arms crossed, and watched her make her way down the platform. She smiled, small but certain. She limped slowly, steadily. The distance between them shrank. When she was just a few steps away, he didn't speak. His gaze dropped, scanning from her eyes to her cane, then to her left foot, where her boot was scuffed from dragging slightly in the snow. "I thought," he muttered. Clara's grip tightened on her suitcase. "I thought you said it wasn't bad." She blinked. "I said I walked with a limp. I didn't lie." Thomas looked past her. "I thought it'd be more manageable. Discreet." A pause. Cold wind threaded between them. "You came all this way," he said, almost to himself. "But I need someone who can help with the land, not someone I'll have to carry. I didn't ask to be carried. Well, I won't be cruel about it. But this won't work." And just like that, he tipped his hat, turned, and walked away. The steam from the train hissed again, this time louder, as if mocking her silence. She stood there, still. Her suitcase sagged against her knee. The letter, warm in her glove, now felt like it belonged to a stranger. A woman to her right gasped softly, whispering to her companion. A man nudged his son and shook his head. Clara didn't cry. She simply turned away from where Thomas had vanished and limped toward the edge of the platform. The cold wood beneath her boots creaked. Each step felt heavier. She didn't know where to go. She didn't know who to ask. Her instructions had been to meet Thomas and ride back to his ranch. That was it. Her money had bought the train ticket and the dress. All that remained now was a bruised pride, a half-full coin purse, and the ache in her hip that always got worse in winter. She found a bench under the station eave and sat down slowly. Snowflakes began to drift, fat and slow. Her breath came out in little clouds. By mid-morning, the townsfolk had mostly gone. The train left again, leaving silence in its place. A dog barked somewhere. Bells chimed faintly from a church tower. Clara remained, still holding the letter. A woman approached her at midday, wore a thick shawl, and smelled like soup and flour. "You waiting on someone?" Clara hesitated. "Not anymore." The woman's brow furrowed. "You're the mail-order girl?" Clara nodded, ashamed of the label, though it was true. "Well, that fool didn't deserve you then." The woman glanced down at the cane. "You got a place to stay?" "No." "You bake." "I can." "Then come with me. I've got a spare cot in the shed and a sweet tooth that needs tending." Clara didn't move at first, didn't quite know how to thank someone when pride was all she had left. But the woman's face was kind, so she nodded once, stood, and followed her through the snow. They passed by a store. Inside, a boy stared out through the frosted glass and whispered to his mother, That's the woman who got left at the station." The words hit like stones to her chest, but Clara kept walking. At the edge of town, the shed was small but clean. A cot with a quilt, a wash basin, and hooks for her coat. The woman, Mrs. Tally, left her alone and said she'd return for supper. That night, Clara washed her face, changed into her nightgown, and laid the letter flat on her chest as she stared at the ceiling. She didn't cry, but something inside her cracked just wide enough for cold to seep in. Over the next few days, she swept the woman's porch, helped peel apples, stitched a neighbor's apron, and stayed mostly silent. The town began to buzz, softly, curiously, cruelly. They watched her limp from shop to shop with her chin held high, and when she passed, they lowered their voices, but not their eyes. She came all that way and got left. Reckless thing, thinking someone'd take her like that. "I heard she's got something wrong inside, not just a leg." Clara said nothing, not to them. But at night, she whispered to herself, "I am not what they see. I am what I survived." Each day, she earned a coin or two. Enough for flour, enough for dignity. And then one evening, while returning from the dressmaker's with mended thread in her pocket, she nearly stumbled into a tall man carrying a broken saddle strap. He steadied her with one hand, let go the moment she was balanced. "Beg your pardon," he said, voice deep and quiet. She nodded. "You sew?" "I do." He handed her the leather. "This tore last week. Couldn't fix it myself. Miss Tally said you had steady hands." Clara took it gently. "I'll do my best. Don't rush. I'm not in a hurry." He started to turn, then paused. "I'm Elias Ward. Live just north of the ridge." She gave her name, but didn't offer more. He tipped his hat and walked away. She watched him go. His boots didn't crunch too loud in the snow. His shoulders were straight, but not stiff. And for the first time in many days, no one looked at her with pity. He'd simply seen her. And that had been enough. She held the strap close to her chest and felt something strange. Not hope. Not yet. But maybe the faintest stirring of worth. The wind that swept through the town had a habit of finding cracks in windows, doors, and the skin of anyone who dared to walk alone. Clara made Jenkins move through it without flinching. Her cane struck the dirt rhythmically, like a clock counting time backward. Most days, she carried a small basket lined with a cloth she embroidered herself. Inside were loaves of bread, yeast-scented, brown just so, with crusts that cracked beneath a spoonful of butter. She didn't charge much. Some gave coins. Others, a bundle of herbs, a spool of thread, a few apples. She took it all with grace, never asking for more. They called her the rejected bride. Not to her face, of course, but she saw it in the sideways glances, the pregnant pauses in conversations, the way children whispered behind coat sleeves. She lived in the shed behind Mrs. Tally's home, a little lean-to with a crooked door and a quilt hung as a curtain. The woman let her stay for chores and kindness, not out of pity. They didn't talk much, but they shared a rhythm. Mornings were for kneading dough, middays for stitching or scrubbing, evenings for soup and soft silence. Every town had its rhythm. Clara had learned to move quietly within it, not seeking attention, just enough space to exist. One morning, the widow down the road, Mrs. Kettle, stood on her porch shouting about a ripped hem and aching bones. Clara went to her, without being asked, needle and thread in her apron. She stitched the tear, fetched firewood, and didn't linger long enough for thanks. She wasn't trying to earn favor. She was trying to matter, however quietly. That afternoon, a boy named Aaron, no more than 8, tripped outside the general store and bloodied his knee. Clara tore a strip from her own petticoat and bound the cut. His mother blinked twice, then pulled him away without a word. But that evening, a jar of peach preserves was left at Clara's door. Word spread slower than gossip, but faster than truth. The crippled girl was helpful, polite, didn't beg, kept her eyes down, her hands busy. Still, she remained to whisper, until the day Elias Ward came back. He didn't knock, just stood outside the shed, holding a bundle wrapped in canvas. "Shirt tore clean across," he said. She stepped outside, shielding her eyes from the sun. "You can fix it." "I can." He hesitated. "And if I can't pay today?" I don't ask ahead. He gave a short nod. You don't talk much. Not unless there's something worth saying. That earned a faint smile. She worked on his shirt that evening, by lantern light, her needle steady despite the ache in her hand. The fabric was worn but strong, like the man who'd worn it. She didn't know much about Elias. Only what Mrs. Tally muttered between bites of stew, that he'd buried a wife young, never remarried, kept to himself on a ranch full of cattle and silence. When he came to retrieve the shirt, he brought a book. Not payment, he clarified. Just something to borrow. Thought you might like it. It was leaves of grass, spine cracked, edges yellowed. She held it like it might sing. I used to read by firelight, he said. But these days I just watch the fire. That night, Clara read aloud to herself, mouthing the words in the dark. Whitman wrote of the self, the body, the soul. She didn't fully understand it, but she understood enough to know that someone, somewhere, had also walked differently and still found beauty in it. Days passed, then weeks. He came again. A glove to mend, a belt to reinforce. She never asked why a man who lived alone had so many things to fix. Sometimes he sat on the stoop while she worked. They talked, softly, sparsely, not about the past, but about bread recipes, the weather, books. One day he asked if she missed home. She said, I never had one. Their silence after that wasn't awkward. It was shared. One morning, Clara woke early to start dough. The sky was the color of faded bluebells, the air cold enough to nip at her nose. She was rolling the loaves when she heard a knock at the front door. Mrs. Tally answered. Clara kept kneading. Moments later, the widow stepped into the kitchen with a look she didn't wear often. Something between surprise and approval. That Ward fellow just left this, she said, holding up a bundle. Inside was a tin of tea leaves, a soft scarf, and a note. For mornings colder than your hands can bear. Clara touched the fabric, fingers trembling just once before she steadied them. That afternoon, she carried loaves into town as usual. The scarf lay across her shoulders, cinnamon brown and warm as a hug. At the bakery, a woman she didn't know asked where she got it. Clara said softly, it was a gift. And for the first time, the woman didn't look at her with pity, just curiosity. She passed Elias that evening near the livery. He didn't speak, but he nodded. She nodded back. That was enough. It was always enough. Weeks later, while mending a saddle strap, Clara paused to ease her leg. The pain had worsened in the cold. She pressed her palm against her thigh until the ache dulled. She didn't hear the footstep until a shadow crossed the door. Hurting. Elias asked. Some days more than others. He stepped closer, gently. You ever rest? Resting makes me feel useless. You're not useless, Clara May Jenkins. He said it like he was reciting scripture. She looked up then, fully. That's the first time you said my name. I know. The silence stretched, long and full of meaning. Then he added, I don't mind the limp. She held his gaze. Good, because I'm not hiding it. He smiled then, real and full. Didn't think you would. That night, she sat on the porch and watched the stars blink awake. She ran a thumb over the worn corner of leaves of grass, the words echoing softly in her mind. I exist as I am, that is enough. In the stillness, something began to shift. She had been the girl who was left. Now she was the woman who stayed and stitched and baked and listened and mattered. She had come west for a man. But perhaps, in the quiet hours between rejection and recognition, she had found something better. A life. Elias Ward didn't visit often enough to be predictable, but often enough to be felt. He arrived with the sun behind him and the dust soft beneath his boots, always holding something worn, a belt, a shirt, a question he hadn't yet found words for. Clara began to notice the pauses between his sentences, the way he lingered just long enough to let silence speak for them both. She never asked why he came. He never asked if she minded. That, perhaps, was the beginning of something. One morning, he brought a stack of books in a small sack. Not all were poetry. Some were novels, others historical tales. One a children's primer with hand-drawn animals in the margins. He placed them on her work table with the kind of reverence people usually reserve for church. I thought you might like a change, he said. I do. They didn't read them together, not right away. But each time he returned, he asked which she'd finished. And Clara, who hadn't spoken this much to any man since she arrived, found herself quoting lines she liked, explaining stories she didn't. I think I understand this one, she said once, thumbing through a book of parables. It's about loss, but also about choosing to live in spite of it. Elias had nodded, but his eyes said more. They always did. She began baking an extra roll on Thursdays. Just one, set aside, tucked in cloth. He never asked for it. She never offered it. But when he came, it was there waiting. And he always took it, his hand brushing hers in the exchange. There were no declarations, no stolen glances that burst into passion. But there was warmth, the kind that built slowly, like coals beneath ash, waiting for breath. One evening, as the sky slipped into lavender and gold, Elias arrived with a shirt torn across the shoulder. Barbed wire, he muttered, holding it out. You'd think I'd learn. Clara took it from him gently, fingers grazing the edge of the rip. You don't strike me as careless. He smiled. No, just human. She began mending by lamplight. He stood by the door, watching, arms folded, eyes scanning the room. It was a small space, just a cot, a basin, a few hooks for clothing, and a crate stacked with books. But it smelled of cinnamon and soap, and the fabric rustled like leaves in quiet wind. Do you miss the city? He asked suddenly. Clara paused. I miss the sound of carriages, sometimes, and the feeling of being invisible. Invisible. In a crowd, no one stares. Elias stepped closer. I don't stare. She didn't look up. You don't look away either. Another silence, full, thick, honest. When she finished the stitching, she handed the shirt back, but he didn't take it. He was still watching her, eyes soft, searching. I notice things, he said. How your hands never shake when you sew. How you always give the best crust to the widow first. How you say less when you're hurting more. She swallowed. The air between them shifted, not heavier, but truer. Elias, she said, voice just above a whisper. Why do you keep coming? He took the shirt then, folding it slowly. Because I feel more myself when I'm near you. No one had ever said that to her. Not in words. Not like that. I'm not much, she said. You're everything I thought I'd never find again. Her heart beat, so loudly she was afraid he might hear it through the floor. I walk crooked. I adjust my stride. And that was all. The next week, he didn't come. Nor the week after. She told herself it was ranch work. That the herd needed mending. Or the roof did. But still, she waited. Kept the extra roll warm. Left leaves of grass on the windowsill. Open to the page they'd last discussed. The town, meanwhile, was shifting. The whispers softened. Someone asked her to hem a wedding dress. Another offered to buy her bread for the church gathering. One of the children she'd bandaged now waved at her each morning, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Still, she felt his absence like a misstep on a familiar trail. Then, on the 15th day, he returned. His left hand was wrapped in gauze. His coat was soaked from the waist down. I'm sorry, he said. Fell crossing the creek. Tried to be faster than the mule. Lost that argument. Clara helped him inside, guided him to the chair, unwrapped his hand with care. 2 fingers were bruised, one cut deeply, but clean. You should have come sooner. I didn't want you to see me weak. She gave him a look that melted the rest of the distance between them. Then you haven't been paying attention. He smiled, winced, then reached for her hand, not quickly, but deliberately. He held it like it was something sacred. Her fingers rested in his palm, scarred and calloused, yet delicate in how they met his. I've never danced, she said. I haven't in years. I'm afraid I'd fall. Then I'll fall with you. She met his eyes, and in that moment she saw herself fully, not in the way a mirror showed her, but in how he saw her. Not despite the limp, the rejection, the stares, but because of the strength that rose in her anyway. Because of the woman who stitched other people's lives while hers was still healing. He leaned in, pressed his forehead gently to hers. They didn't kiss. They didn't need to. In the quiet between them, something had already been promised. The next morning, she rose early and baked 2 loaves instead of 1. And when she stepped outside, scarf wrapped tight, cane steady in her grip, she saw him waiting down the path, not with a gift, not with a torn glove or saddle strap, but with nothing at all. Just himself. And the way he looked at her, like she was the beginning of something good. The town square had been swept clean of dust that morning. Paper ribbons fluttered from fence posts, and pies cooled on every flat surface like offerings to the day. Spring had come late, but it had come boldly. Trees wore new green like pride, and the air was perfumed with lilac and with smoke. They called it the Founders' Day Social, a gathering with fiddle music, bread baskets, and laughter that dared to stretch past grief. There were booths, lemonade, even a wooden dance platform near the well. People came in their Sunday clothes, with polished boots and fresh soap behind their ears. Clara hadn't planned to go. She'd ironed her only dress the day before, then folded it neatly and set it aside. She told herself she'd be tired, that she had bread orders to fill, that her leg ached. But none of those were the truth. The truth was, the dance wasn't meant for her. It was meant for girls with nimble feet and unblemished names. For wives with matching rings and babies on their hips. For the kinds of women men didn't leave behind at train stations. But Mrs. Tally stood in the doorway that morning, hands on her hips, and said, "You're going. I don't belong there. You didn't belong on that bench at the depot, either. And yet, you're still here. So go." Clara held the dress against her chest, pressing her lips together. It was a soft blue, worn at the hem, but clean and carefully stitched. Her limp was worse that day. She took twice as long to braid her hair, hands shaking as she pinned the ends beneath her scarf. She left late, walking slower than she had in weeks. As she approached, she could already hear the music, a jaunty tune layered with boots stomping in time. Children ran past her, trailing laughter. A girl offered her a flower without pausing to ask why she moved so differently. Clara tucked it behind her ear. When she stepped into the square, heads turned, not all, but enough. She felt the old shame try to rise, like a ghost in her chest. But this time, it didn't stick. Maybe it was the music. Maybe it was the way she'd survived. Maybe it was the fact that she didn't need anyone's permission to be seen. She stood near the tables, far from a dance floor, watched as couples spun clumsily, laughed too loudly, and let their burdens fall away with the dust. She'd just reached for a glass of lemonade when she saw him. Elias Ward, standing by the old oak, clean-shaven, his shirt pressed, his eyes already locked on hers. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. He walked slowly, as if every step was deliberate, measured not by time, but by intention. And when he reached her, he said nothing at all, just offered his hand. She stared at it. Her fingers tingled. Her heart pounded. "You know I can't dance," she said. "You can lean on me." Her throat tightened. "Everyone's watching. Let them." Still, she hesitated. "It'll be uneven. Then I'll follow your rhythm." His voice was quiet, not demanding, not saving, just offering. She placed her hand in his. They stepped onto the platform. The music slowed, a gentler tune now, something made for stories instead of stomping. People turned to look, some with surprise, some with kindness, a few with the kind of awe reserved for things they didn't understand but couldn't deny. Clara moved cautiously. Her left foot dragged just slightly, but Elias adjusted without missing a beat. He kept his arm firm around her waist, not tight, not guiding, just steady. And in that moment, she realized something. She wasn't just being tolerated. She was being chosen. She looked up into his face and saw nothing but clarity. A man who had seen broken things and learned to love them anyway. A man who didn't need a perfect wife, just a real one. "I never imagined this," she whispered. "I did." Tears gathered behind her eyes, but didn't fall. They danced one full song. Then another. When the music ended, people clapped, not just for the tune, but for them. She heard it in the way the sound lingered. Not out of pity, but respect. Elias leaned in then, and in front of the whole town, he kissed her. So, with both hands cradling her face like she was something precious. something whole. The town didn't murmur. It didn't flinch. It simply watched and understood. She stepped off the platform slowly, his hand still holding hers. A girl handed her a slice of pie. A man tipped his hat. And Mrs. Kettle, who once said she'd never trust a woman who came from a city, pressed a parcel into Clara's hands and said, "This is yours now. You earned it." Clara walked home with Elias at her side, the path lit only by the last rays of sun and the music still humming in her bones. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Somewhere along the road, she leaned against him, not out of pain, but out of peace. And he didn't flinch. He simply shifted to carry more of her weight. Morning mist clung to the ridge like a secret. Dew soaked the steps of the porch Elias built plank by plank, his boots still marked with sawdust. Clara stood barefoot, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, watching a kettle steam on the small stove inside the house they now shared. He had built the porch low, just as she'd once murmured she liked it. Low enough so her feet could graze the earth as she sat and rocked, low enough that she didn't have to climb. They hadn't married in a church. There had been no preacher, no music, no bouquet. Just two chairs, side by side under the big oak tree, and a promise said, without ceremony. "I don't need a vow to keep choosing you," he told her, looking into her eyes like she was made of more than flesh and flaw. And she, in turn, had said, "You are the home I didn't know how to want." Now the days passed in gentle rhythm. She still baked, still stitched. He still worked the land, still smelled of hay and worn leather. But there were differences, small ones. The way he waited for her to step through a door first. The way she left the lamp burning until she heard his boots at night. The way their silences no longer held loneliness, only peace. The town had changed, too. The same people who once whispered about her now came by with eggs, requests, stories. A child brought her a drawing, 3 stick figures and a heart. The child said, "That's you and Mr. Ward and the cat." They didn't own a cat, but Clara smiled anyway and pinned the picture to the pantry wall. One Sunday afternoon, she walked to the post office on her own, cane tapping softly against the boardwalk. The man behind the counter looked surprised when she asked for paper and a pen. He handed them over without a word. She returned home, sat at the table, and wrote a letter. She didn't write to the man who had once rejected her. She didn't write to her old city, or even to her mother, who had died long before Clara ever boarded that train. She wrote to the version of herself who once stood on a foggy platform with nothing but a crutch and a crushed letter in hand. She wrote to remind that girl she had made it. Later that evening, Elias found her asleep on the porch swing, the unfinished letter folded neatly on her lap. He didn't wake her, just lifted her gently, carried her inside, and covered her with the quilt she'd sewn from scraps, every patch a different chapter of her journey. One night, as frost returned to the windows and the fire crackled low, he asked her if she ever thought about leaving. "Leaving where?" she asked, puzzled. "This place. This life." She touched his hand. "Why would I run from where I was finally seen?" He kissed her forehead. "You saved me," he whispered. "No," she said. "We recognized each other in the ruin. That's different." Winter came heavy. The sky turned silver. Her limp worsened in the cold, but Elias never let her struggle alone. When it snowed, he cleared the path before she even asked. When her hands ached, he tied her apron gently. When she couldn't reach something, he brought it down without fuss. He didn't love her despite anything. He simply loved her. And one evening, sitting beside her with his calloused hand resting over hers, he told her what he had never told another soul. "I lost a child. Years ago. Before the war. She was only 4. Clara's breath caught. "No one asks about her," he said, his voice brittle. "No one remembers." "I will," Clara whispered. He wept then, for the first time she'd ever seen. Not loudly, just quietly, with his face buried in her shoulder. She held him through it, her hand tracing small circles over his back. She didn't need him to be strong every moment. She only needed him to be real. And when he looked at her again, eyes red, heart open, she knew they had stepped into something sacred. Not romance, not even love. Something deeper. Recognition. restoration, refuge. Time passed. They planted a garden. She taught him how to braid bread. He taught her how to sharpen tools. They fought once, over nothing and everything. She cried. He left. Then returned before sunset, holding 2 apples and no excuses. They apologized in the way people do when they know words are only part of healing, through actions, gestures, time spent sitting shoulder to shoulder in the dark. She grew softer in the places she had once armored. He grew louder in the places he had once sealed shut. One spring morning, he came home with paint. She asked why. "I'm building you a bakery. Just a little one." She didn't know what to say. He smiled. "You don't have to earn your place anymore. You've already built it." Later that year, the town gathered for another festival. This time, it was Clara who brought the bread. It was Elias who carried the tablecloth, and the 2 of them who danced first when the music began. She still limped. But now, no one saw it as a flaw. Not because she changed, but because they had. And now, dear listener, if you've made it this far, hear this. If the world ever called you too broken, too crooked, too difficult to love, remember Clara May Jenkins. She came west with a limp and a letter. She left the train with nothing but her name and a basket of bread. And still, she carved a place in the world with quiet dignity and unshakable grace. So when someone tries to make you smaller, when they look at your limp, your grief, your scars, and call them burdens, remember, you do not need to be fixed to be chosen. You only need to be seen. And if you ever forget what you're worth, lean a little. Someone out there is strong enough to hold you.
The wind didn't howl that day. It whispered, soft and cutting, the kind of cold that made folks turn their collars and mind their own business. Samuel Coleridge, a man with more dust than pride clinging to his boots, rode into Cold Creek not for trouble, but for a bag of grain and a part for his wagon wheel. He hadn't spoken more than a handful of words all week, and he liked it that way. Silence didn't judge. Silence didn't ask about the wife buried under the cottonwood tree or the mortgage stamped in red ink. But silence broke that day. Behind the saloon, where old crates and rusted spittoons lay forgotten, a small crowd had gathered like flies to rot. No music, no auction bell. Just murmurs, eyes flicking toward the alley then away again, as if seeing it might brand their souls with shame. He dismounted slow, tied his horse loose. Curiosity wasn't virtue, but something about the hush behind that saloon gripped him. And then he saw her. She wasn't crying. That would have been easier. Her dress was plain and patched, the hem muddied from travel. One hand rested over her swollen belly, the other hung limp. Blonde hair, tangled and wind-bitten, framed a face too pale for summer. A man stood beside her, bearded, mean-eyed, smelling of sour whiskey. Another leaned against a barrel, arms crossed, a twisted smile on his face. Brothers, Samuel would later learn. In-laws, to be precise. The kind that made a man wish the law bit harder. "Don't look like much," one of them muttered to a fat merchant with dirty fingernails. "But she's healthy enough. Child's near to term. Strong stock. Could be of use if you got hands need warming." Someone chuckled. Another spat. Samuel's jaw tightened. The girl didn't flinch. Didn't speak. Just stared down at the cracked ground like she might vanish if she stared long enough. "That's enough," the merchant said. "I'm not talking no charity case with a mouth to feed. She ain't charity. She's kin. Husband passed, left debts. We're settin' things right." Someone muttered, "Ain't no preacher at this auction." Samuel took a slow step forward. One of the in-laws turned. "You lookin' to buy, stranger?" he sneered. The girl lifted her eyes then. Briefly. Just once. They locked with Samuel's. Not pleading. Not broken. But hollow. The kind of hollow you get when the world keeps taking and never says sorry. "No," Samuel said. "Just lookin'." But he wasn't. There were stories in the girl's silence. Rage, shame, quiet defiance. Something twisted in his chest. He'd buried a child once. Just one. Born too early. Buried beside his wife the next week. That wound never healed. But somehow this girl's silence brushed right up against it. The bearded man laughed. "Don't worry. She ain't got the strength to protest. Never did. Always soft-spoken. Makes it easier." The girl's lips moved. No sound came. But she blinked like a storm was behind her eyes. "Where's the sheriff?" someone whispered. "Probably paid not to see." Samuel felt heat rise in him. Not the kind that made fists fly. The colder kind. like frostbite working up from the bones. He stepped closer. How much you want? The merchant and both in-laws turned. The girl did not. Bearded one squinted. You serious? Samuel nodded. A long silence. $50, the man spat. And a rifle. If you got one. Samuel reached into his coat, tossed a leather pouch, then slowly unhooked the old Winchester from his back. You're a damn fool, someone muttered. The bearded man snatched the rifle like it was candy. Coins were counted without ceremony. She's yours. Samuel didn't move. What's her name? Does it matter? He looked at her. She looked back. Yes. The girl's voice came, small and cracked. Eleanor Dumont. It broke something open in him. A name. A voice. That's all it took to turn her from object to person. He offered his hand. She didn't take it, but she stepped toward him. That was enough. They walked through town like ghosts. The sun dipped low. No one stopped them. A few eyes lingered, but most turned away. Guilt makes cowards of decent men. He helped her into the wagon. Still no tears. Still no questions. She sat with her hands folded over her belly, staring ahead like a woman sentenced to something she didn't understand. The wagon creaked as it rolled out of Cold Creek. Dust rose in swirls behind them. They didn't speak for a long while. Finally, Samuel said, You don't owe me nothing. You understand? She didn't answer, but she turned to look at him. Just for a second. Then forward again. The sky grew purple. Stars blinked through like shy children. They stopped for the night in a hollow near the riverbed. He built a small fire. Gave her his coat. She took it but didn't speak. He offered jerky and cornbread. She ate without tasting. I ain't a man who saves people, he muttered. Just didn't want to leave you there. Still silence. The fire cracked and danced. She finally spoke. Quiet, raw. They weren't always cruel. He didn't answer. Some truths didn't need echoing. They said I was a burden, she said. Too much to feed. Said my husband's death made me worthless. Samuel stared into the flames. They were wrong. She looked at him. Then back to the fire. I don't know where we're going, she whispered. Neither do I. The baby kicked. She flinched. He noticed. You all right? She nodded once. Then asked, Why'd you do it? Samuel hesitated. Then, because I saw my wife's eyes in yours. Eleanor Dumont blinked. The firelight shimmered on her cheek. He rolled out a blanket for her. Took the hard ground himself. They didn't speak again that night. But something shifted. A brittle warmth beneath the cold. As Samuel stared up at the stars, he wondered, not for the first time, if redemption came quietly. Not through grand gestures, but through one broken soul reaching for another. And in that still night, with fire low and frost creeping near, Eleanor Dumont turned toward him in the dark and whispered, Thank you. He didn't answer, just closed his eyes, because maybe that was the beginning. And tomorrow he knew would ask everything from both of them. The morning came heavy with fog. Not the light, drifting kind, but thick as wool, wrapping the world in a breathless hush. Samuel woke before dawn as he always did. Years on the land had trained him to rise with the cold. But today he lingered a moment longer, watching the still shape on the blanket beside the embers. Eleanor Dumont hadn't moved much through the night. Curled inward, both arms wrapped around her middle like she feared something might be taken from her in the dark. Her breathing was shallow, steady, like a woman who had learned not to make noise, even in sleep. He stood, brushed the frost from his coat, and set to making coffee. Quiet, deliberate motions. The way he used to move around wild animals. By the time she opened her eyes, steam curled from the pot and the fire had grown to a soft amber glow. She didn't speak. Just sat up slowly, one hand steadying herself, the other cupping her belly. Coffee? He asked. She nodded once. He poured her a tin cup. She took it with both hands, sipping slow, the metal rattling against her lip. I figure we can reach the ranch by sundown, he said. It ain't fancy, but it's dry. Gotta bet. Stove works fine when she's fed right. Still no words. But he didn't push. After all, silence wasn't always absence. Sometimes it was armor. They rode in quiet. The wheels groaned beneath them. The mule snorted now and then, swishing its tail against imagined flies. Trees crept by like ghosts in the mist, their trunks thin and wet as old bones. She asked nothing. Not about the ranch. Not about him. Not even where he came from. So he told her anyway. I was raised in Kansas, he said. Dustier than here. Meaner too. My father was a preacher. My mother died birthing my sister. She didn't last past 6 winters. No response. Just the rhythm of hooves. I left at 16. Thought I'd find gold. Found cattle instead. He glanced at her. Still she said nothing. But her fingers clenched slightly in her lap. My wife Miriam was better than I ever deserved. She had freckles like cinnamon. Could outshoot me with a rifle and outbake any woman in the county. We lost our first child in the spring frost. She passed 2 months later. A breath escaped him, half memory, half wound. Eleanor Dumont turned her head just slightly toward him. Then forward again. But something in her shoulders softened. When they reached the ranch, the fog had lifted. Sunlight cut across the land in gold ribbons, making the frost sparkle like it had secrets to keep. The house stood plain and weathered, 2 windows missing shutters, porch slanted. But it held the air of something honest. Samuel helped her down from the wagon, careful not to touch her longer than needed. She moved slow but steady, each step cautious. Let me show you inside. She followed him through the creaking door. The interior was spare, wooden walls, simple table, 2 chairs, iron stove, and a room off to the side with a bed barely large enough for one. His wife's quilt still lay across it. She paused in the doorway, reached out, ran her hand along the edge of the patchwork like it might bite her. I can take the barn tonight, he offered. You rest. Her voice was barely there. No, I'm not helpless. He nodded, not sure what to say to that. So he said nothing. She settled slowly onto the bed, boots still on, back upright. He returned with a basin of warm water and left it beside her without a word. Outside, he chopped wood until his arms burned. Not because the stove needed it, but because silence sometimes roared louder than screams. By nightfall, she had washed and folded the quilt down. Her hair was damp, her face a little less pale. But her eyes, those stayed guarded. Supper was bread, beans, and dried apples. She ate slow, mechanically, like someone who hadn't tasted food in months but had forgotten how to savor. As they sat across the table, he finally said, "You're safe here." She didn't meet his eyes. "Safe don't mean not scared," she said, barely above a whisper. He nodded. "I know." A long pause stretched between them. Then, softly, "His name was Daniel. My husband. He wasn't cruel. Just tired. Died of fever after the child quickened." Samuel listened, hands still. His family said I owed them. That I'd brought the sickness. That I'd eaten more than I worked. They told me to leave, but not before making sure I was taken care of. Her voice broke slightly on that last part. "I'm sorry," he said. "They called me a burden," she continued. "Said I'd cursed them." He looked at her hands, thin, rough, trembling faintly. "You're not a burden," he said. She looked up then, sharply, as if the words slapped her. "You don't know me. Don't need to." Silence. Then, "You still gonna make me your wife?" she asked. He shook his head. "Only if you ask me to." Her breath caught. "I won't ask," she said after a long pause. "Then I won't push." They sat in that stillness, both holding their scars like keepsakes. The next few days passed in quiet rhythm. She swept the floor, cooked what she could. Sometimes she sat on the porch and stared at nothing for hours. Other times she helped feed the mule, her hand brushing its nose like she was remembering softness. He kept his distance. Let her own the silence. Then one evening, while he mended a fence near the paddock, she came out with a steaming cup. "Coffee," she said, holding it out. He blinked, took it carefully. "Thank you." She didn't reply, but she stood there close, not touching, just near enough that he felt her presence in his ribs. "I used to hum," she said quietly, "when I was a girl. I haven't in a long time. Maybe you will again." She didn't answer. But the next morning, as she folded laundry on the porch, he heard the faintest sound, barely there. A note. Maybe 2. A hum, broken but brave. He didn't look up, just kept whittling the wood in his hands. That night, rain came heavy. Thunder rolled far off. He lit the lantern and sat by the stove. She stood in the doorway of the bedroom. "Do you believe in second chances?" she asked. He set down the knife. "I think they believe in us," he said. She nodded, stepped into the light. "You've been kind," she said. "But I'm still afraid." "So am I. I don't want to be owned." "You're not." "I don't want to be saved." "Then just stay." The silence between them turned warm for once. She walked over, sat across from him. The lantern flickered, painting her face in gold and shadow. Her voice was stronger now. "I don't know how to be loved." "You don't have to." She blinked. "You just have to sit here," he said, "and not run." She stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she reached across the table. Not for his hand, but to place her palm flat beside his. A nearness. A beginning. Outside the wind howled. But inside, something fragile and sacred held still. And in that quiet moment, as thunder echoed in the hills, Samuel realized. She wasn't wrapped in silence anymore. She was unfolding. Spring came early that year. The snow that clung to fence posts melted into the thirsty earth, and the ground cracked open like it had something to say. Buds swelled on trees that hadn't dared bloom in seasons. And on the porch of a weathered ranch house just outside Cold Creek, a woman stood barefoot in the early sun, one hand on her belly, the other resting on the porch rail. She didn't smile, but she breathed deeper. Samuel watched from the field, one boot in the stirrup, as the mule shifted under his weight. The sight of her standing there, quiet, real, still learning how to take up space again, did something to him he couldn't name. Eleanor Dumont had begun rising before him some mornings, making coffee and setting the table with deliberate care. She didn't talk much, but the silence between them had softened. It wasn't fear anymore. It was soil. And something had started growing. She asked to help him mend the barn roof. He said no. She insisted. He handed her nails, showed her how to set them. Her hands were slow but certain. When she slipped on the shingles and let out a gasp, he caught her. Just a touch, his hand at her back, her palm flat on his chest. For a moment, neither moved. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, cheeks flushed. But the heat wasn't from fear. In the evenings, she sat on the porch sewing baby clothes from old curtains and worn flannel shirts. Her fingers moved like memory, thread, needle, breath. She'd never had much, but she wanted something soft waiting when the child arrived. Samuel built a cradle in the shed. Worked on it at night by lantern light, shaping the wood slow and clean. When she found it one morning, she didn't say a word. Just ran her hand along the curve of the frame and left a jar of jam by his coffee cup. In town, rumors had begun to change shape. At first, he bought her at auction. Then, she don't talk much. Must be simple. But lately, he's building her a porch swing. She's teaching his mule to bow its head for sugar. People talked. People always did. But Eleanor Dumont held her chin a little higher now. And Samuel never answered back. He'd never had use for town opinions before, and he wasn't about to start now. One afternoon, she asked to go with him to the general store. "You sure?" he asked. She nodded. "I want to see something besides these four walls." She wore her late husband's hat low, her old dress tight across her belly. Her boots didn't match. But she walked into that store like a woman who remembered who she was. Mrs. Dellinger, the storekeeper's wife, raised a brow. "You look well, dear." Eleanor Dumont's voice didn't waver. "I feel well." They bought flour, beans, and a bit of blue ribbon. When Samuel asked about the ribbon, she said nothing. But later at home, she tied it around her braid and looked at herself in the window. For the first time, she saw something worth looking at. That night, under the oil lamp's hum, Samuel brought out an old record box. Not music. Letters. Recipes. The burnt-edge photo of his late wife. She was beautiful, Eleanor Dumont said, holding the picture carefully. "She was," he said. Silence. Then, "and kind?" "The kindest." Eleanor Dumont traced the edge of the photo. "I'm not her." "No," he said. "You're not." She looked up, bracing. "But you're here." Her eyes welled. But no tears fell. Instead, she said, "I want to plant tomatoes." He blinked. "Next to the fence," she added. "And lavender. I remember the smell from when I was little. We'll get seeds this week." "Good." He watched her carefully. Something was shifting. Not just in her but around her. As if the house had exhaled. As if the land knew it had another woman to care for now. And then came the knock. It was late. Too late for neighbors. Samuel stood from the table, reached for the rifle hanging near the door. Eleanor Dumont froze. The knock came again. When he opened the door, 3 men stood outside. One had a wide hat and narrow eyes. Another chewed tobacco like it was his only skill. The third he recognized. Eleanor Dumont's brother-in-law. "Evenin', Coleridge," the man said with a crooked smile. Samuel didn't return it. "You're not welcome here. We just come to check on kin." "She's not yours to check on. She's carrying blood," the man said, stepping forward. "Family blood." Eleanor Dumont appeared behind Samuel, one hand resting on the doorframe. "She told you no," Samuel said. "That ought to be enough." "Easy there," the man grinned. "Ain't here to fight. Just talk. Maybe take her home." "She is home." The man's eyes narrowed. You think buying her changes that? Eleanor Dumont's voice came clear and strong. You're not taking me. Samuel glanced at her. Her face was pale, but her jaw was set. The brother-in-law spit in the dirt. You think you'll raise that child without our name? Without what's owed? You gave up rights when you sold me, she said. I'm not your debt. He laughed, but it was bitter. This ain't over. Samuel shut the door in their faces. Eleanor Dumont didn't tremble. Not then. But later, when she sat on the porch in the dark, he heard her breath catch. He stepped outside, blanket over one arm. You knew they'd come, she whispered. He sat beside her. I figured. They want the child. They can want all they like. Pause. Wind stirred the trees. I'm scared, she said. So am I. She turned to him. Her face was bare open. I don't want to run again. You won't. She looked at him then. For a long time. And in that look, something passed between them, like hands touching without touching. He draped the blanket over her shoulders. I've been thinking, she said softly. Maybe I will ask. Ask what? She looked away but smiled just barely. To be your wife. Samuel said nothing. Just reached over and took her hand. Held it. Let the warmth of that single gesture speak louder than any vow. Inside, the fire crackled low. And outside, the seed she'd asked to plant waited beneath the thawed ground, ready like her to begin again. Eleanor Dumont woke with a weight pressing on her chest, not from the child she carried, but from the quiet. It wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the kind that came before a storm. The birds had not yet started their morning song. The wind outside moved in low sighs. Something had shifted in the air, though she couldn't say what. She pressed her hand against her belly and waited. Samuel was already outside, splitting wood by the barn. She could hear the measured rhythm of his axe, each strike a steady beat in the song of their days. Reliable. Familiar. Safe. But safety, Eleanor Dumont had learned, was often an illusion, a blanket too thin to cover what waited beneath. She stepped outside into the golden light, wrapped in her shawl, her braid loose down her back. Samuel saw her and lowered his axe. You all right? He asked. She nodded but didn't smile. Something's wrong. He didn't question her. He'd come to trust her instincts like he trusted the seasons. Unpredictable but rarely mistaken. By noon the wind had picked up. Dust danced across the hills and the mule paced near the fence. Eleanor Dumont stayed close to the house, eyes scanning the horizon. When the riders came, they came slow. Deliberate. 3 of them again, same men as before but this time armed and less courteous. The brother-in-law led, face smug beneath his hat. Samuel stepped down from the porch, rifle across his back, jaw tight. Eleanor Dumont stood in the doorway, one hand resting on her stomach, the other on the frame. Afternoon, the man said, spitting to the side. We come for what's ours. Samuel didn't move. You came for trouble. You signed nothing. Ain't no preacher tied you to. She's still legally ours and that baby's kin. She's not yours, Samuel said, his voice low. She never was. The man dismounted, slow, drawing a folded paper from his coat. Got a signature here, he said, waving it. Her late husband owed us half the homestead. Since he's gone and she's carrying his heir, we figure we're owed what's left. You'll get nothing, Eleanor Dumont said from the doorway, her voice cold as iron. He turned toward her. You think this man can protect you? He's got nothing. You think this shack and his silence make you safe? I don't think, she replied. I know. He stepped toward the porch. Samuel raised the rifle. That's far enough. The man stopped. You gonna shoot your wife's family? He sneered. Samuel didn't blink. If I have to. The man laughed, backing off. You think this ends here? You think a paper won't find its way to the court in Cold Creek? Go ahead, Samuel said. Bring the law. But you'll lose. 'Cause I married her, yesterday morning. Pastor Evans signed the record. Witnessed by his wife and the town clerk. The man froze. You're lying. Go check. Eleanor Dumont stepped down beside Samuel. She took his hand, right there in front of the men who once sold her. I chose him, she said. That's what you never understood. You can't sell someone who doesn't belong to you. The man's eyes burned. But he knew he'd lost. Not just in law but in presence. Still he left a warning. You'll regret this. One day when the child's sick or hungry or looking for a name, and you got nothing left to give. Eleanor Dumont held her head high. Then I'll give them this story. Of how we stood our ground. He turned and rode off without another word. The others followed. Silence returned to the homestead, but it was heavier now, like a rope pulled too tight. Samuel set the rifle aside, shoulders dropping. "You really went into town and married me?" Eleanor Dumont asked, teasing a little edge into her voice. "I did," he said. "Didn't want to presume. Figured you'd say no. I was planning to ask you today." He looked at her. "Well, beat you to it." She smiled then. A real one. Not wide, but warm and unguarded. That evening the wind calmed. The sun dipped low, spilling orange across the earth. They sat on the porch swing he'd finally finished, her head resting against his shoulder. Inside, the cradle waited. Beside it, a stitched name, her own, embroidered into a small quilt. Eleanor Dumont stared out across the prairie, then whispered, "You think they'll come back?" "Maybe. But they won't get through me. I believe that." Pause. "I never thought I'd feel safe again," she said. "You're not safe," he replied. "Not in this world. But you're not alone." She closed her eyes. That night, she lay in his bed without fear. No promises spoken, but a quiet vow lived in the spaces between them. Outside, the ground shifted again, spring digging in, stubborn and slow. And within her, a different seed turned toward the light. The fire came at night. Not a thunderclap blaze, but a slow, crawling beast that crept from the edge of the fields and found breath in the dry hay. By the time Samuel smelled the smoke, it was already too late for the barn. He bolted from the bed, shotgun in one hand, pulling on boots with the other. Eleanor Dumont followed, robe dragging behind her, one hand braced on the doorframe, the other cradling the child still beneath her ribs. The flames had reached high into the rafters. Sparks flew like angry stars. The mule cried from its tether, wild-eyed, desperate. Samuel ran in, coat over his head, teeth clenched against the heat. He cut the rope, slapped the animal's flank and stumbled back, coughing, eyes watering. The barn groaned. A beam crashed behind him. Eleanor Dumont shouted his name, her voice a sharp thing in the night air. He staggered toward her, smoke curling from his shoulders, and she caught him halfway to the porch, pulling him back like a tethered soul from hell. Neighbors saw the fire. They came with buckets, blankets, and rough, weary hands. Mrs. Dellinger brought bread. The young storekeeper ran barefoot carrying a jug of water. Someone, Samuel didn't know who, said they'd seen a rider leave the property not long before the blaze. But no one spoke the name. No one needed to. Samuel didn't curse. He didn't shout. He watched the barn collapse in on itself like a prayer unanswered, then turned and walked back to the porch. Eleanor Dumont followed, hand tucked in his. The next morning, smoke still drifted in gray threads across the sky. Ash clung to the windows. The cradle inside the house had been untouched. So had the quilt. Eleanor Dumont sat at the table, a shawl wrapped tight around her. Her eyes were steady, her voice quiet. "They want to break us," she said. Samuel poured water into a tin cup, set it before her. "They won't," he said. She looked at him for a long time. "I believe you." He reached across the table, took her hand gently. His calluses had softened a little in the months since she'd come. Or maybe hers had matched his. Later that week, Eleanor Dumont went into labor. It came sudden, in the blue hush before dawn, with the wind howling low and fierce across the plains. Samuel didn't panic. He gathered water, boiled cloth, called for the neighbor woman who'd delivered 3 of her own. Eleanor Dumont gritted her teeth and gripped the bedpost until her knuckles bled white. The pain was long. But when the baby's first cry filled the room, it was louder than the fire had been. A boy, dark-haired, soft-lunged, furious at being born into such a world. Eleanor Dumont wept, cradling him to her chest. Samuel didn't cry, but he stepped outside, stared at the rising sun, and whispered his wife's name into the wind, not Miriam but Eleanor Dumont. She was his wife now, and this was their world. The weeks after were quiet but not still. They rebuilt the barn with the help of neighbors who no longer whispered behind hands. Eleanor Dumont planted tomatoes along the fence and lavender beneath the window. The baby's laughter came soft and slow, but when it came, it lit the house like a second sunrise. One day, Samuel found her sitting in the dirt, baby in her arms, ribbon in her hair, smile tucked into the corner of her mouth like a secret she no longer had to keep. "I thought I'd die out here," she said. "You didn't." "No," she said. "I lived." And Samuel, who had buried one family, realized he'd grown another. Not through blood but through choice. Through fire. Through silence that had become speech and wounds that had become roots. That fall, they held a second wedding, this time with neighbors present, and rings traded beneath the cottonwood where his first wife lay. Eleanor Dumont placed a small flower on the grave, not for jealousy, but for gratitude. At supper, Mrs. Dellinger raised a glass and said, "May the child carry both their names." He did. In town, no one questioned them anymore. They were a unit. A man who spoke little but protected much. A woman once sold, now seen. And a child born in the middle of both their storms. Sometimes, on still nights, Eleanor Dumont would sit on the porch and hum. And Samuel, rocking the baby in his arms, would close his eyes, not to rest but to remember how it all began. With a whisper behind a saloon. With a silence that needed no saving. And with a man who didn't ask for love, but waited long enough to earn it. Let them write history in books about the wars and outlaws. This one would be written in soil and ash and soft blue ribbon. And for those who ever doubted whether broken things bloom, Eleanor Dumont had her answer. She lived it. And in that wind-swept prairie, under skies that knew sorrow and sun, a woman once auctioned now sat as a matriarch, head high, heart full. Because love on the frontier wasn't built in ballads. It was carved with patience, lit by fire, and kept alive by those brave enough to stay.
The train groaned as it pulled into the quiet station, metal grinding like an old man's knees. Smoke swirled above the platform, softening the sun just enough to turn every silhouette into a question mark. She stepped down slowly, a worn carpetbag in her left hand, her right gloved and gripping the railing as if the world might shift beneath her feet. Her name was Etta May Holloway, and this was the farthest west she'd ever dared to travel. She wasn't young enough to be called a girl anymore, but she was not old, either not in spirit. Her face carried the soft roundness of someone who had fed others before feeding herself. Her hips bore the shape of long workdays in aprons and rocking chairs. She had the kind of frame the East never forgave and the kind of soul the West hadn't yet learned to see. The letter in her pocket crinkled as she moved. She'd read it at least 30 times between Missouri and here, lips tracing the words. I seek a woman of warmth and good character. A sturdy woman, unafraid of a hard life. If you're such, come west. We might build a life worth sharing. Signed in slanted ink, Harlan Cobb. She had imagined him with broad hands and soft eyes. Someone who didn't wince at curves or cower at silence. She imagined growing beans in a garden, laying quilts across a real marriage bed. Nothing extravagant, just peace. A hand to hold, a place to rest. But no one stood waiting with flowers or even a lifted chin. Only a scattering of townsfolk, a barking conductor, and the boarding house owner squinting toward her like she hadn't been expected after all. Inside the inn, she sat with a straight back, shoes together, hands folded. She wore her Sunday blue dress, altered twice to fit her form without apology. She had brushed her hair into thick braids, looped and pinned with the care of someone trying to make a good impression without seeming desperate. The room smelled of biscuits, of coffee going cold, and faintly of lavender, likely hers. The other girls had already come and gone. Mail-order brides claimed by ranchers or store owners, their futures sealed with nervous nods and tight-lipped smiles. Etta had arrived late. A delay in Kansas. She should have known delays cost more than time. When the door opened, she stood quickly. A tall man entered, square shoulders beneath a wool coat, but his eyes landed on her and blinked once, twice. Disbelief, not delight. You're Etta, he asked. She smiled, as gently as one could smile when everything rested on a single greeting. Yes, sir. Etta May Holloway. He didn't take another step. Just looked her up and down like he was checking measurements no one had promised. I thought, he said, then cleared his throat. No offense, but you're not what I pictured. The room chilled around her, though the stove burned hot. I brought your letter, she said softly, reaching into her pocket. He didn't take it. His eyes darted to the innkeeper behind her, then to the open door behind him. I'm sorry, he mumbled. This won't work. And just like that, he left. The door didn't slam. It simply closed with finality, the kind of ending that doesn't beg for a sequel. She stood for a long moment, her breath shallow, as if too much exhale would shatter her. The boarding house matron sighed behind her. Men, she said, not cruelly, just tired. Etta nodded barely. I understand. She returned to her seat, poured herself tea that had gone lukewarm, lifted the cup to her lips though the taste had turned bitter. She wouldn't let her hand tremble. Not yet. By evening, her name was known. Not in the warm, neighborly way names are known, but whispered sideways with a shrug or a smirk. The fat one. The last one. The one he left. A town of 300 now carried her story before she'd spoken more than 20 words. She spent the next few nights in the smallest room at the back of the boarding house, where the window stuck and the mattress groaned. She unpacked slowly. One dress, one shawl, a folded quilt stitched with her mother's initials, and a photo of a family long gone. On the windowsill, she placed a mason jar and dropped a penny in each morning. A quiet promise to herself. One day, you'll leave with more than you came. Each day she walked the wooden sidewalks, head high though her heart sagged. She asked around for work, light sewing, cleaning, kitchen help, but most homes had daughters, and most shops had judgments. We'll let you know, they'd say, but they never did. She bartered a pie for a bundle of firewood, washed dishes in exchange for scraps of lard and flour. Her hand began to crack from cold water and colder greetings. One morning, she passed a group of children playing marbles. One boy pointed and whispered, loud enough to land like a slap. She's the one nobody wanted. Another giggled. She didn't pause, didn't scold, but when she turned the corner, she allowed herself one tear. Just one. At the church steps, she stopped, bent to gather fallen leaves that swept against the door like forgotten prayers. She cleaned without being asked, not for favor, just for peace. Inside, the pastor watched but said nothing, only nodded once. That was enough. In the market, she waited at the back of every line, not because she had to, but because she didn't want to be stared at while others chose apples and she chose bruised ones. Still, she smiled when spoken to. Still, she thanked the Lord at night. Still, she believed, not loudly, not with the fire she'd left Missouri with, but quietly. The kind of belief that smolders, waiting for wind. One afternoon, she walked past the dry goods store and paused. A man stood near the porch post. Not young, not old. Beard a shade between dusk and dawn. He wasn't looking at her, just chewing a toothpick, watching clouds. But as she passed, his gaze shifted. Not sharp, just aware. She didn't know his name, only that his eyes didn't hold mockery. Inside the inn that night, she wrote a letter she didn't send. Dear Mama, he didn't want me, but I still want something. I'm not sure what, just yet. Maybe it's not a man. Maybe it's a morning where I don't flinch. Maybe it's a kitchen of my own. Maybe it's a child who never hears the word to, like a curse. She folded it and tucked in her Bible. And in the quiet, she whispered aloud, I ain't done. Not yet. The mornings came colder now. Frost clung to the glass like the breath of someone still waiting for warmth. Etta woke before dawn in her little room behind the kitchen, wrapped in her shawl, hands pressed to her cheeks to summon heat where there was none. Each morning, she lit a match and whispered, one more day, like a woman bargaining with something larger than herself. The pie stand was born not from ambition, but hunger. Hunger for coins, for dignity, for something to do besides disappear. She borrowed a rusted tin pan from the boarding house cook, traded her last yard of lace for pecans, and sold her first pie for 10 cents to a man who didn't look her in the eye. That was enough. Word traveled slowly, but it traveled. The woman who'd been rejected now stood behind a table by the church steps every morning. Apron clean, hair tied back with stubborn purpose, pies lined like soldiers. She didn't call out, didn't ask anyone to stop. She simply stood, and they came. The town didn't welcome her, but began to accept her edges. One child liked her apple crumble. One old widow said her crust was as fine as any east of Kansas. A young woman, pale and pregnant, once placed 2 coins and whispered, Thank you. Folks forget what kindness tastes like. That stayed with Etta longer than the coins. Still, kindness was not currency. Whispers still danced behind her back like smoke. One man walked by with his friends and laughed. That's a lot of woman for such a small table. She didn't flinch. Not outside. Inside, the hurt curled into itself like a burned edge on parchment. Work became ritual. Her fingers bore flour like a badge. She stitched aprons for the pastor's wife, mended curtains for the schoolhouse, and once darned a boy's Sunday trousers in exchange for 3 eggs. Every thread was a thread back to her own worth. One Sunday, the boarding house owner told her she needed to start paying full room rate or find another place to lay her head. No pity, just facts. Etta nodded, went upstairs, packed her satchel, and left that very night. She found an abandoned storage shed near the edge of town, once used for trapping tools and forgotten since. It didn't have a stove, but it had a roof and a door. She swept the floor with a pine branch, made a bed of quilts on hay, and lay down with her back to the wall. A stray wind crept through the cracks and kissed her cheek, but she whispered into the dark, "I am still here." The next morning, she opened her pie stand like nothing had changed. Whispers shifted again, not softer, but slower. People began nodding to her. A few asked her name, as if unsure whether they were allowed to. She gave it without flinching. Etta May. No shame in the syllables. She began to notice faces. The girl with the red braid who always bought the last pie. The widower with hollow eyes who never spoke but left double the price. And then there was him. He came on a Tuesday, lean, with shoulders built from chopping wood and hands that looked like they'd once held grief. His name was Luke Kerrigan. He bought a pie without saying much, just nodded. She noticed the way he watched her, not with hunger or mockery, but something else. Recognition, perhaps. The next day, he returned, bought another, sat across the street on a bench, and ate it slow, like each bite meant something. She didn't speak, didn't ask, but her chest tightened in a way that wasn't pain. He came every third day after that. Sometimes he spoke, sometimes he didn't. Once he said, "You remind me of someone." She didn't ask who. The silence between them held the weight of two lives learning how to stand again. One evening, she walked to the creek to wash her pans. The sky burned gold and blood red, the way it does only in places where the land stretches wide. She knelt in the cold water, hands aching, and heard footsteps behind her. It was Luke. "You're staying out by the old trap shed?" he asked. His voice wasn't pitying, just curious. "I am," she said simply. He nodded. "Takes grit." She shrugged, water dripping from her sleeves. "Takes hunger." That was the first time he smiled at her. A real smile. One that made her forget, for half a second, that the town had called her too much. The next morning, there was firewood stacked outside the shed. No note, just warmth. Over time, she learned more. Luke had a wife once. She died giving birth to a daughter who didn't live past sundown. That loss had carved lines into his face that no smile could ever quite erase. He worked a lonely patch of land just beyond the ridge and didn't talk to folks unless he had to. But he talked to her. Not every day, but often enough that the silence stopped feeling like punishment. In town, she still heard whispers, but now they were confused. The fat woman who was dumped now laughed sometimes, smiled like she belonged, walked with a man who didn't flinch when she passed. It unsettled people. Maybe it reminded them that kindness and love were not prizes for thinness. One afternoon, Clara, the butcher's daughter, ran up and said, "Miss Etta, your pecan pie's my pa's favorite now." Then whispered, "He says you've got a magic hand." Etta chuckled, brushed a crumb off Clara's chin, and said, "Tell your pa I make it with stubbornness and spite." The girl giggled, then ran off. That night, in the shed, Etta lit a candle and opened her Bible. Tucked behind the back page was the letter Harlan Cobb had once written. She didn't cry as she read it. She just held it to the flame, watched it curl, blacken, and vanish. She wasn't angry. Not anymore. Just done carrying what didn't serve her. The next morning, Luke handed her a book. "It's silly," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "But I thought maybe you'd like it." It was Jane Eyre, a story of a woman unloved by the world who still found her own voice. Etta touched the cover and said, "You think I'm her?" He shrugged. "I think you're braver." She didn't speak, just smiled, one that reached all the way to her eyes. By the time the first snow fell, the town had stopped calling her anything at all. They just nodded, paid her fare, and moved on. She had made herself part of the rhythm, a beat in their routine, a scent on the breeze, a woman who didn't go away. And Luke kept coming. He never offered to save her. He never tried to fix her. He simply saw her. And for the first time in a long, long while, so did she. The days shortened and the air grew crisp, But she kept selling her pies beside the church steps, bundled in wool, cheeks flushed pink from the cold. Her fingers, once cracked and raw, had grown deft with repetition, tying string around boxes, smoothing wrinkles from cloth, pouring warmth into each crust as if hope were an ingredient no one else could see. Luke Kerrigan still came, never on a schedule, but always just when silence had settled too thick around her. He brought her books, paperbacks with creased spines and dog-eared corners. She read them by lantern light in the shed, her breath fogging with every page turned, her heart slowly remembering how to flutter. He asked for nothing. Sometimes he spoke of small things, a neighbor's mule gone missing, a broken fence, the taste of her plum tart. Other times, he simply sat beside her table, sipping coffee from a tin cup she'd warmed on the coals. One afternoon, she caught him watching her. Not her face, not her body, but her hands as they moved with quiet grace over pie dough. When she looked up, he didn't glance away. He held her gaze like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Funny," he said, "how your hands make things feel safe." She opened her mouth to reply, but the words tangled. So she only smiled, and the silence that followed was the softest sound she'd ever known. By late November, the town began preparing for the winter festival. There'd be a fire in the square, a table of baked goods, and a raffle. Children practiced carols in the schoolhouse. Men hammered planks into a dance floor. Etta didn't expect to be invited, but she offered to bake for the gathering. No one refused. Not anymore. She spent nights rolling dough until her arms ached. Apple, cherry molasses. Her tiny shed filled with the scent of cinnamon and sugar. Clara stopped by after school to help. Her fingers sticky, her stories bright. Etta taught her how to crimp edges and fold napkins. Sometimes she caught Luke watching from a distance, arms crossed, a rare smile tugging at his lips. One evening, he brought her a carved wooden box. No explanation. Inside was a thimble, a folded ribbon, and a smooth river stone. She looked at him, puzzled. "They were my wife's," he said. "I kept them because I didn't know how to let go. Thought maybe they could mean something again." Etta didn't speak. She just closed the box gently, held it to her chest, and whispered, "Thank you." Her hands trembled around the corners. He didn't touch her, just tipped his hat and walked away. Snow came that night, light at first, the kind that melts as it lands. She opened the shed door in the morning and watched it fall, tiny flakes catching on the rim of her mug. Her breath rose in small puffs, and for once, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, something was beginning. They started sharing meals. Not planned, not declared. He'd arrive with a jar of stew. She'd offer slices of pie. They ate in the quiet warmth of her shed, knees brushing under the crate turntable, speaking in fragments. "You always this quiet?" she asked once. He shrugged. "I talk when it matters." She liked that. There was no performance in him. No flattery. Only presence. One night, the wind howled louder than she'd heard in weeks. Her door creaked and banged. The fire sputtered. She curled in her quilts, eyes wide in the dark. Then came a knock, firm, familiar. Luke stood outside, dusted in snow, carrying his second quilt. "Didn't sit right with me, thinking you were cold." She let him in. They sat close, wrapped in separate quilts, backs to the wall, watching the candle flicker. "I ain't used to company," she said. "Me neither," he replied. The silence that followed didn't feel empty. It felt like safety. When the festival came, she dressed in the soft green gown she'd once hoped to wear for a wedding. It hugged her frame with honesty, not apology. She brushed her hair, pinned it with a silver comb, and stepped into the churchyard like a woman who belonged. People noticed. The mayor's wife complimented her cinnamon rolls. A young man tipped his hat. A child reached for her hand without flinching. And then there was Luke, standing by the fire, holding 2 mugs of cider. He offered her one without a word. She took it, their fingers brushing. His eyes searched hers. "Will you walk with me?" he asked. They circled the square once, slowly. Lanterns glowed from window sills. Laughter rang from the dance floor. She tucked her hand into the crook of his arm without asking. He didn't flinch. "I don't know what this is," she said, breath catching. He stopped walking, faced her fully. It's not something I planned, he said, but it's something I want. She blinked, snowflakes caught in her lashes. Even with, especially with, he interrupted gently. With everything you are. She stepped back, only slightly. You're not just being kind. He shook his head. No, Etta, I'm just being honest. For the first time in years, she believed it. Later that night, in her shed, she stared at the wooden box. She lifted the thimble, ran her thumb over the smooth metal, and smiled. This wasn't borrowed love. It wasn't a leftover. It was something earned through resilience and kindness, stitched slow and strong. Luke came the next day with a wagon. Thought maybe you'd like space to bake properly. She laughed, soft but deep. You offer me a kitchen? I'm offering you whatever you'll take. She paused. What if I want you to? He grinned. Then I'm the lucky one. No promises, no vows, just the beginning of something real. And in that simple exchange, love did not arrive with fire or music, but like dawn, quietly, steadily, and full of light. The lanterns were strung the night before, one by one across the town square like stars caught and tethered. Pine boughs wrapped the fence posts. Tables lined the street, draped in quilted cloth, weighted with tins, steam, and stories. The annual winter gathering was never grand, but it carried the whole town's breath. Folks came to warm their hands, trade small words, and pretend for one night that life wasn't hard or cold or cruel. Etta stood behind her pie table just as the first snow fell. Not a storm, just a fine, floating shimmer that seemed more blessing than burden. Her green dress returned, pressed and pinned. She wore her mother's brooch at the collar and a braid curled around each ear. She looked like herself. Not someone new, not someone changed, but someone finally seen. Children darted between booths. Clara brought her a sprig of holly and tucked it behind her ear. You look like a Christmas story, she said, eyes shining. Etta smiled and handed her a hand pie in return. The townsfolk noticed. They didn't gawk, not exactly, but glances lingered. The man who'd once called her too much woman now tipped his hat. The banker's wife who once refused her sewing now complimented her pie crust. Whispers still moved, but they softened, uncertain whether they were still allowed to mock a woman so clearly unbothered. Luke arrived just as the sky turned orange behind the mountains. He wore a dark wool coat and had trimmed his beard. He looked every inch the man he was, quiet, self-made, carrying his grief not as a wound but as a shadow that taught him how to stand still and listen. He didn't go to her right away. He stood across the square for a moment, watching her, watching the way she laughed with Clara, the way she wiped pie filling from child's chin, the way she placed her palms on the edge of her table like it anchored her to the world. Then, slowly he crossed the square. When he reached her, he didn't say hello. He simply placed a folded linen handkerchief beside her pies. Embroidered on the edge, barely visible, her initials. You made this, she asked, tracing the thread. He nodded. I figure it was time I learned. She smiled and held it against her chest. That's the kind of gift I don't forget. The music began, a fiddle, a harmonica, boots tapping against wood. A makeshift band on the courthouse steps. Couples gathered on the dance floor. Etta turned to her pies, ready to serve another round. But Luke didn't leave. He stood beside her, his hand resting on the table's edge, inches from hers. And then, softly, would you dance with me? She froze, her breath caught like a snowflake on the edge of a flame. Her eyes scanned the crowd. People had already turned, watching, waiting. She could say no, keep the safety she'd built, the quiet dignity. But instead, she reached for him. They stepped onto the dance floor, hands joined. The music wasn't fast, not slow, just steady. She placed her hand on his shoulder, and he placed his on her waist, not hesitating, not shrinking, not hiding. They moved, not with grace, not with showmanship, but with truth. It wasn't a dance for applause. It was a dance of memory, of every pie she had baked alone, every tear she hadn't let fall, every word he had never spoken until now. As they swayed beneath the lights, something changed in the square. The silence wasn't judgment anymore. It was awe. He leaned close, voice low. I know I haven't said it plain, Etta, but I think I could love you. I think I already do. Her throat tightened. Even with how folks see me? I see you better, he whispered. The music stopped. Stillness held the crowd. He turned to them, not raising his voice, not making a show, just letting the truth sit where it belonged. She's the strongest soul I know, he said. If you've got eyes, you ought to see that. Someone clapped. Then another. It wasn't thunderous, but it was honest. He turned back to her, holding both her hands now. I've got no fine words, he said, but I've got a quiet home and a want that hasn't faded. I want you in it, if you'll have me. She didn't cry. She only nodded, lips trembling into a smile that stretched all the way down to where she'd once carried her shame. Yes, she said, and the square seemed to exhale. Later that night, as the fire crackled low and people began to drift home, Luke walked her back to her shed. The snow crunched beneath their boots. Their arms brushed with each step. They didn't speak. At the door, he paused. It's not much, he said, but I'd like to build you a kitchen, one with sunlight in the morning, a window above the sink. She leaned her head against his shoulder. I'd like that. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small cloth bundle. Inside it, a key. It's just a cabin, he said, but it's warm. It's yours. Whenever you're ready. She took the key, held it in both hands like a relic. And then, with a breath of wind between them, she kissed him. Not a kiss for drama or approval. A kiss that said, I've lived through fire and silence, and still I have love left in me. Snow clung to the earth like a final silence. Winter had taken its hold, but in the small wooden cabin near the ridge, warmth pulsed through every wall. The fire burned slow. A stew simmered in a cast-iron pot. Bread baked in a modest stove, filling the room with the scent of home. Etta stood at the window, the one Luke had promised. It framed the prairie like a painting, wide, white, and quiet. Morning light spilled through, brushing her cheeks gold. Her hands were dusted in flour, her sleeves rolled to her elbows. She wore no corset, no disguise, just the soft weight of her body and the stronger weight of being chosen. Luke came in from the cold, arms full of wood. His beard was frosted, his eyes bright. He stamped the snow from his boots and looked at her like he always did. Not with hunger, not with pity, but with the gentlest reverence. You've got dough on your nose, he said, walking to her. She laughed and swatted him with a cloth. He leaned down and kissed her anyway, the kind of kiss that didn't ask for anything, the kind that simply said, I'm here. They didn't speak much that morning. Words weren't needed. They moved around one another with the ease of two people who had suffered their share of loneliness and finally found the silence that didn't hurt. After breakfast, they took a walk along the creek that curved just beyond the fence. The water hadn't frozen over yet. It still sang, soft and stubborn. Like her, they reached the same bench where, months before, she'd first seen him sitting with a pie in his hands. Back then, he had barely spoken. Now, he held her gloved fingers in his and clear his throat. You've changed me, he said. She tilted her head. I didn't ask you to. I know. That's why it happened. They sat for a while, watching geese fly overhead in a V so clean it looked drawn. He pulled something from his coat pocket, an envelope, worn at the edges. I wrote this a while back. Never sent it. He handed it to her. She opened it slowly, careful not to tear the edges. The writing was rough, the ink blotted in places. Etta, there's no poetry in me, so I'll say this plain. I saw you before I spoke to you, and when I did, I knew you were the kind of woman a man doesn't forget. The kind of woman who holds, not just herself, but others. I want to be held like that. Not out of mercy, out of want. She pressed the letter to her chest. You should have read it to me sooner. I was afraid, he said. I thought I'd already lost too much in this life. And now, she asked, I think I've finally found enough. That night, they sat by the fire. Clara came to visit, bringing a bundle of pine cones and a half-finished scarf she'd been knitting. She climbed into Etta's lap without asking, leaned her head on her chest, and whispered, You smell like cinnamon and comfort. Luke looked over and smiled. She's not wrong. It was that kind of evening, the kind where nothing dramatic happens, yet everything changes. It was the moment a house stopped being wood and nails and became a home. When Clara left, Etta sat at the table and began a new letter. Not to Harlan, not to the town, but to herself. Dear Etta Mae, you didn't come west to be saved. You came to be seen, and you were. Not for your softness or your pie crusts or the steadiness in your hands, but for the fact that you stayed soft in a world that tried to harden you. You bent, but you did not break. You waited, but you never begged. You were left behind, but you still stepped forward. She folded the letter and tucked it into the Bible, the same one that had carried her through nights of cold and insult. It had more than scripture inside now. It held her history. Outside, the wind picked up. Snow swept across the porch. Luke lit a lantern and carried it to the window, setting it there like a signal for anyone wandering too long in the dark. Later, as they prepared for bed, he paused at the doorway, watching her brush out her braid. He stepped closer, took the brush from her hand, and began to comb gently. "You're more beautiful every day," he said. She turned to him. "Even on the days I don't believe it." He nodded. "Especially then." She wrapped her arms around his waist. He held her not tight but true, and in that quiet embrace, a life rewrote itself. Now I want to speak to you, yes, you, the one reading this tale by firelight or phone glow. If the world has ever told you you were too much, too big, too quiet, too plain, too bold, remember Etta. She wasn't chosen first, but she was chosen right. She was not less for being left. She was not broken for being rejected. She simply outlasted the lie that told her she wasn't enough. So if you were standing in a storm with no one waiting at the station, or baking a pie with no one to share it with, hold fast. Your strength isn't loud, but it is enduring. Your love isn't small. It's just waiting to be met with someone who's not afraid of all that it is. Let the world whisper. Let them doubt. But when the moment comes, walk out in your green dress, hold your head high, and take the hand that reaches without flinching. Because love, real love, doesn't weigh you. It walks beside you. And sometimes it arrives not with fanfare, but with a wooden bench, a pie, and a man who says, simply, "You, I see you, and I'm not going anywhere."
Dust hung low in the early light, clinging to every wooden beam, every dry leaf, every breath Eliza took as she stepped onto the warped porch. Her hands were still red from digging in the frost-bitten earth, trying to unearth the last stubborn potatoes while her daughters slept side by side in the same coat. She hadn't noticed the rider approach, but she heard the nails, 3 of them, slammed into her door with the precision of a man who did it daily and without remorse. Sheriff Callum. Gray beard, gray hat, gray eyes. The kind of man whose silence felt heavier than a threat. "You're late," she said hoarsely, shielding her eyes. The wind stole her shawl's edge and flapped it like a rag. He didn't answer, just pointed at the paper now nailed to her door. Her stomach folded inward. She stepped closer. Her eyes caught on the bolded line. Property seized. Debt to be settled by possessions or persons. Her voice cracked. "This land's mine. My husband paid for." "He lost the deed in carts," Callum said. "To Bishop." The name struck like a slap. Bishop. The saloon keeper. The man who never looked a woman in the eyes just below the chin. "You can't take my girls. Law says collateral's fair game. I'm just the hand, not the hammer." Eliza stepped in front of the door like she could shield them with her shadow. "Then I suggest you get off my land before I fetch my husband's rifle. You do that and they won't be sold. They'll be buried." He tipped his hat like he'd done her a kindness, then turned his horse. She watched the dust bloom around his boots as he rode off toward town, slow as sin. She didn't cry. Not then. Ruth, her eldest, watched from the loft. 11 years old with a gaze like flint. May 7 clutched a faded rag doll with no name, her face still soft with sleep. "What's collateral mean?" May asked. Eliza didn't answer. Instead, she busied herself with bread she couldn't afford to bake, water she barely had to boil. Her fingers trembled as she shaped dough that would never rise. She wiped them on her skirt and looked out over the fields. Frost glittered over dead vines. Their last cow had been sold 3 weeks ago. The well was half mud. The last letter from her husband's family had read, "You're on your own now." And so she was. The next day the town bell rang twice before noon. That meant a public gathering. That meant the Bishop boys were moving fast. By the time Eliza and her girls reached the square, half the town was already gathered. Some with hats over hearts. Others with coin in their fists. The platform wasn't high. Just enough to make you feel small. "Name?" the clerk asked. "Eliza Marin." "And the girls?" She hesitated. Ruth, May. The man scribbled. Ages? 11. 7. Healthy. Her jaw clenched. Their children. He looked up. So were the last ones. That didn't stop the gavel. A low murmur spread as Eliza stepped up. Some pitied her. Others just wanted the spectacle. Bishop leaned against the post, smoking a cigar that glowed like an ember of hell. His grin was wide. We'll start the bidding low. I'm generous. The gavel rose. And Eliza couldn't breathe. May held Ruth's hand, unsure, barefoot, their dresses mended one too many times. The clerk called out numbers. Eliza heard them through cotton. $10. 12. 15. Ruth flinched when Bishop raised his hand. 25 for the older, he called. Ruth's fingers squeezed tighter. May looked confused. The gavel hovered. And in that moment, Eliza almost screamed. But her voice failed her again. Then someone spoke behind them. I'll take them both. The voice didn't shout. It cut clean through the noise like a knife through an apple. The kind of voice that didn't need to explain itself. It carried weight. A man stepped from the edge of the crowd. Dusty hat. Sun-leathered skin. Broad shoulders. Calm eyes. He looked like someone who'd lived more in silence than speech. Samuel Hayes. Some folks knew him. Most didn't. He owned a ranch on the outskirts, far from the town's thirst for power and coin. Rumors said he'd once had a family. Others said he'd buried them. I said I'll take both girls, he repeated. Bishop chuckled. And what exactly will you do with cowboy? Teach him how to herd cattle or wash your shirts. Samuel's eyes narrowed. I'll set them free. Laughter rippled through the crowd. But not from Eliza. The sheriff frowned. Ain't how this works, Sam. Samuel reached into his coat. Pulled out a pouch. Dropped it at the clerk's feet. The sound of silver clinking inside silenced everyone. That enough. The clerk looked at Bishop. Bishop scowled, but the sheriff nodded. It'll do. The gavel dropped. The ride back to Samuel's ranch was silent but strange. May sat beside Samuel on the wagon bench, staring at him like he was a riddle. Ruth stayed behind, arms crossed, eyes watching everything. Eliza rode on a mule behind the wagon. Her pride burned. Her shame stung worse. You didn't have to do that, she muttered as they reached the edge of his land. No, I didn't. Then why? Samuel didn't answer for a long time. The wagon creaked. The prairie rolled by in golden tufts. Because I've seen what happens to girls left in that man's hands. And what about us now? You'll stay. A while. Get warm. Get strong. I don't take charity. I didn't offer it. Eliza stiffened. Then what's this? A choice. You're free to go. But you ain't got to. He pulled the wagon to a stop by a modest house, weather-beaten, quiet, and clean. A barn beside it. Fenced pasture. A well. A porch swing that still moved slightly in the breeze as if someone had just risen from it. That night, after the girls were tucked into the hayloft of the barn and the lanterns were dimmed, Eliza stood outside under the cold moon. She stared out at the horizon, arms wrapped around herself. Samuel came out with 2 mugs. Offered her one. Coffee? She asked. Not much left. Hot water and a pinch of grounds. She took it anyway. They stood in silence. I failed them, she said. No, you didn't. I let it happen. You didn't walk away. She looked up at him. The moonlight caught the old scar near his collarbone, barely visible. You lose someone? She asked. He nodded. Wife. And a daughter. Eliza swallowed. Then why help us? Doesn't it hurt? Samuel looked toward the barn. Some hurts ain't meant to fade, but sometimes they can be repurposed. Later, as Eliza lay on a makeshift bed inside the old pantry, she heard Ruth whisper to May. Do you think he'll keep us safe? May replied softly. He didn't blink once. And outside the wind stirred the dust again. But this time it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like something starting. Something uncertain. Fragile. But real. And the hammer, at least for now, had fallen in their favor. Samuel's ranch wasn't much by town standards. One sagging barn. A split-rail fence that leaned toward the horizon. A house built by hands that had known both labor and grief. But to Eliza, it felt unnervingly still, like time had curled up and gone quiet here. The girls were fed, bread and beans, and slept in the loft above the main room, curled like pups in borrowed quilts. Eliza stood by the window, arms crossed, watching the wind stir the dying stalks in Samuel's field. You think it's done? She asked. Samuel didn't look up from the ledger on his table. I think they're humiliated. She turned to him. That's not the same as safe. No, he said. It's not. Eliza walked the length of the room slowly, studying the shelves lined with worn books, a rusted rifle hanging over the hearth, a wedding ring nailed into a beam. Her voice softened. That hers. He nodded once. You never took it down? Didn't see the point. She leaned against the wall. Most men would have. He set his pen down. Most men would have let you burn on that platform too. She didn't reply. Didn't need to. The next morning came hard and cold, breath visible in the early sun. Ruth was already outside, hauling a pail of water with slow, stubborn strength. May sat cross-legged on the porch, rubbing her eyes. Where's the barn cat? She asked. We don't have one, Samuel said from the steps. May frowned. Why not? He shrugged. Too many hawks. May's mouth twisted. I could be one. A barn cat. If I had whiskers. Samuel smiled without showing teeth. Eliza noticed that. The kind of smile that had been forgotten for years and didn't know how to come back properly. By midday the heat returned, unseasonable and sharp. Samuel brought out a wagon and hitched it. Where are you going? Eliza asked. Town. Her shoulders tensed. Alone? He paused. I'm not taking the girls with me if that's what you mean. She stepped closer. You shouldn't go at all. They'll come for you. He looked down at her. That's the plan. You think they won't shoot you in the street? He swung up onto the seat. They might. You're not God, Mr. Hayes. No, he said. But someone's got to speak like they remember what he sounds like. She watched him ride away, dust curling behind the wheels like smoke. The town hadn't changed in a day. Still smelled like horse and whiskey. Still whispered like it had secrets to sell. Samuel walked straight into the sheriff's office and placed 2 papers on the desk. Callum looked up slowly. You got a habit of causing dust storms. Samuel folded his arms. These are copies of Bishop's forged deeds. From the notary's own desk. And this, he tapped the second page, is the original deed to Eliza's land. Not her husband's. Hers. Callum didn't move. And how'd you get those? I asked. Who signed off on it? Samuel smiled. A woman with 4 sons and no patience for gamblers. Callum leaned back. That's still not the law. Samuel leaned forward. No. But it's the truth. The sheriff looked at the papers for a long time. Then he said, You know what happens when you strip power from a man who ain't got anything else? Samuel nodded. He gets dangerous. Callum sighed. You planning to keep the girls? No. I'm planning to let them stay. There's a difference. Back at the ranch, Eliza found Ruth sitting on the fence rail, legs swinging, eyes fixed toward the southern ridge. He's not coming back, is he? Ruth said quietly. Eliza walked to her, placed a hand on her shoulder. He said he would. They all say things, Ruth muttered. Papa said he'd stop gambling. That's not the same. He sold our horse for whiskey. Eliza didn't respond. The truth in Ruth's voice was sharp, edged like flint. She knew better than to dull it with comfort. He wasn't always like that, she said instead. But he was in the end. A silence stretched between them, long as the prairie. Eliza could feel her daughter pulling away inside herself, layer by layer, year by year. And she didn't know how to reach through it. You think Mr. Hayes is different? Ruth asked. Eliza swallowed. I don't know what he is yet. Samuel returned that night just before sunset. His face was calm. No blood. No bruises. He brought flour, coffee, and a folded piece of paper. This is yours now, he said, handing it to Eliza. She unfolded it slowly. The land deed. Her name on it. Not her husband's. Not Bishop's. She looked up at him. I don't have a way to pay you, she whispered. I'm not selling. She stared at him for a long moment, then asked the thing she feared most. What do you want? He looked her dead in the eye. Nothing I can take from you. Just something I hope you'll give. She waited. Peace, he said softly. For all of you. If you decide to stay. Later, while the girls played with seed sacks and giggled in the barn, Eliza cleaned dishes by lantern light. Samuel sat outside, whittling something into the dark. I don't know how to accept kindness anymore, she said through the window. You don't have to, he replied. It ain't a contract. But I feel like I'm still owned. You were never owned. You were just surrounded by men who told you otherwise. She turned toward the light and leaned on the sill. Why are you alone? He kept whittling. I was too late. Too late for what? For them. Her breath caught. They were taken? She asked. He nodded. Sickness came hard. I rode for help. Storm came faster. Eliza felt the chill of it, loss that came when you were doing your best and it still wasn't enough. That why you helped us? He paused. Part of it. And the rest. I don't like men who buy people. That night, as the fire crackled and wind pressed gentle fingers against the window panes, Ruth crept downstairs. She stood over Samuel, who had dozed in the chair with a book in his lap. Mr. Hayes? He blinked awake. Yes, Ruth? She held something in her hand. The doll. Its one eye stitched in crooked thread. She said it's good luck, Ruth said, placing it in his lap. But I think it's more about memory. He looked at the doll. Then at her. I'll keep it close. She nodded once and turned to go. Ruth? She stopped. Your mother's stronger than you know. Ruth didn't turn back. But she smiled. In the days that followed, things settled into a rhythm. Eliza helped repair a broken gate. Ruth read books aloud to May. Samuel showed them where the best berries grew, deep behind the hills where hawks flew low and silent. But peace, Eliza knew, never lasted long out here. Especially when men felt humiliated. Especially when Bishop still held grudges. One afternoon, while Samuel was out checking fence lines, a rider came fast across the plain. Dust in his wake. A red bandana across his mouth. Eliza stepped out with the rifle in hand, Ruth behind her with a bucket still swinging. The rider didn't slow until the last second. Message from Bishop. The man growled. He says you've got 1 week to return what's his, or next time it won't be paper. What's his? Eliza hissed. The girls. The land. The dignity. She leveled the rifle. You tell Bishop he never had any of those. The rider grinned. We'll see who's still talking by week's end. He turned and rode off into the dust, leaving the silence behind him sharp and splintered. That evening, Samuel returned to find Eliza standing by the porch, rifle at her side, eyes hard. They sent a warning. He nodded. I expected it. What do we do? He looked toward the hills, where the sky burned orange and the birds flew low. We hold the line. You think we're ready for that? No, he said. But sometimes readiness comes after the fire, not before. The sun dipped. Shadows stretched. And inside the house, Ruth and May braided each other's hair, humming the song their mother used to sing before the world taught her to stop. Out here, memory didn't ask for permission. It simply returned, through smells, through firelight, through the stillness of men who spoke less and meant more. And somewhere deep in Eliza's ribs, just beneath the fear, something else had started to grow. Not hope. Not yet. But something near it. Something shaped like resolve. The sky cracked open that night. Thunder rolled like a drumbeat from God's warpath, and the wind howled over Samuel's ranch as though the land itself knew something was coming. Eliza bolted upright in the dark, her pulse thudding against her throat like a warning. Beside her, Ruth stirred. In the loft above, May muttered in her sleep. The smell reached them first, acrid and sharp like burning rope and pitch. Samuel, Eliza whispered, scrambling from the cot. He was already outside, rifle in hand, eyes fixed on the orange glow rising from the barn. The fire had teeth. Flames licked through the roof like a monster's tongue, devouring beams and shadows alike. The animals were already gone, let out before the blaze took hold. But Samuel's expression didn't ease. Eliza reached him, hair whipping in the wind. It was them, she said. He nodded once. Bishop's boys. They watched the barn fall in on itself, cinders launching into the night sky like dying stars. Eliza stood with her jaw clenched and hands shaking, while Ruth stood behind them both, silent and unmoving. They'll burn more than your barn, Eliza said. Next time it'll be the house. Or us. Samuel turned to her. His face was calm, but the firelight painted a storm in his eyes. They want to make us run, he said. They're succeeding. No, he said. They're provoking us. There's a difference. By morning, all that remained was a black skeleton, smoke still curling from the beams like breath from a grave. May wept when she saw the melted remains of her rag doll in the ash. Ruth didn't speak at all. Samuel worked through the wreckage with quiet hands. Eliza helped him drag what could be salvaged into a pile, burnt nails, half-charred tools, a horseshoe fused with heat. The silence between them wasn't cold, it was concentrated. Where do we go from here? Eliza asked. Samuel didn't stop working. Forward. That's not a direction. That's a wish. He straightened. It's a decision. She studied him. You always this calm when people try to burn you alive? He glanced at her. Only when I expected it. Later that day, while the girls fetched water and tried to act like the world wasn't tipping beneath them, Eliza and Samuel sat at the table, ink and paper between them. "I want to write to the judge," Eliza said. "Send proof of the forged deeds. Ask for a hearing." Samuel shook his head. "He's Bishop's cousin. That letter won't leave the county." Eliza's lips twisted. "Then what?" "We wait." "For what?" Samuel's gaze was level. "For them to step too far." That night Ruth refused supper. She sat on the porch rail watching the dark settle in over the hills. Eliza found her there, arms folded, eyes hard as obsidian. "You think he can protect us?" Ruth didn't look away. "He's just a man. And they're a mob." Eliza sat beside her. "He's not trying to be a hero. Then why's he risking everything?" Eliza didn't answer at first. Then quietly, "Maybe he's not risking everything. Maybe we are." Ruth blinked. "You ever think we're not just being saved, Ruth?" Eliza asked. "That maybe we're the ones saving something too?" The next morning, a note appeared on the fence post, tied with red string. No signature. "Last warning. Leave by Sunday. Or we'll bury the choice." Samuel read it aloud, then burned it without a word. Eliza felt a knot in her throat. "They won't stop, Samuel." "I know. I don't want to be the reason you lose everything." "You're not. You already lost your barn. I've lost worse." The way he said it, quiet, not bitter, made her chest ache. "I'll understand if you ask us to go," she said. "I won't. Even if it means they hurt you?" He looked at her like the question itself wounded him. "I won't," he repeated. Ruth began waking with nightmares. She wouldn't describe them, but Eliza knew what they were. Flames, chains, crowds of men who smiled with no warmth. May, too young to understand the depth of danger, began shadowing Samuel, asking endless questions. He answered each one with a patience Eliza hadn't seen in years. As if kindness were something he practiced like scripture. "What's a sheriff do?" "Depends on the town." "Did you have a daughter?" "I did." "Did she braid her hair like me?" "She did." "Was she funny?" "She was everything." May didn't ask again after that. Just leaned her head on his shoulder and stayed quiet a while. 3 days later, the Bishop brothers returned. They didn't knock. They came at dawn with 3 riders, guns holstered but visible, and smirks slick with certainty. Samuel met them outside, coat unbuttoned, rifle across his lap. "Back for what's not yours?" he asked. The eldest, Dirk Bishop, chewed a stalk of grass. "Thought we'd be neighborly. Make sure no one's squatting where they shouldn't be." "This is her land," Samuel said. Dirk glanced at Eliza, who'd stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. "Women can't own land here. Not without a husband." "She doesn't need one," Samuel said. Dirk smiled slowly. "Then she'll need a coffin." Samuel stood. "Say that again." "I said." The gun was drawn before Dirk could finish. Samuel didn't fire. He didn't need to. Just the motion, the silence, the steady hand was enough. "Next time," Samuel said, "you'll bury your own brother if you try something stupid." Dirk sneered. "You'll regret this, Hayes." Samuel lowered the barrel. "Only thing I regret is not firing already." They rode off, slower than they came but not defeated. "Not yet." Eliza turned to Samuel after they were gone. "That bluff won't work twice." "I know. So, we prepare." That night, as the stars scattered like frost across the sky, Eliza brought a quilt out to where Samuel sat beneath the porch lantern. "You don't sleep much," she said. "I sleep when it's safe." She sat beside him, the quiet, thick and kind. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her. "For what?" "For standing with us. Even now. Even after the fire. I don't see another way I'd want to live. You didn't even know us a month ago." "I didn't need to." "Why?" He hesitated, then said, "Because I saw what it did to you. That day. On that platform. I saw the look in your eyes, and it was the same one I wore when they buried my family." She turned to him. "And what was that look?" "Grief trying to pretend it was rage. Because rage feels stronger. But it isn't. It just burns longer." She blinked tears away. "And what's stronger than both?" He met her gaze. "The will to stay." Inside, Ruth lay beside May, the firelight flickering across their faces. "Do you think we'll have to leave again?" May whispered. "No," Ruth said, stroking her sister's hair. "I think this time we stay. Even if it's hard." May yawned. "Do you trust him?" Ruth hesitated. "I think I trust how Mama looks at him," she finally said. In the yard, the ash from the barn had settled like snow. Soft, silent, but not gone. Just waiting for the next storm. And this time they'd be ready for it. It happened just before dawn, when the world was still brittle with frost and silence. Eliza had barely slipped on her boots when Samuel burst through the door, eyes dark with warning. They're coming. She didn't need to ask who. He'd seen the dust cloud on the ridge. 5 riders, armed, heading straight for them. Eliza turned, grabbed the girls from their sleeping spots in the loft. Ruth was already reaching for her boots. May, half asleep, clung to her doll's remains and asked, "Is it the bad men?" "Yes," Eliza said, strapping on her satchel, "but we're not going to let them win." By the time the wagon was loaded, the sky had begun to pale, streaks of gray brushing the distant peaks. Samuel hitched the mule team fast, his movements clean and efficient. No wasted breath. "They know this land better than we do," he muttered, checking the rifle tucked beneath the seat. "We can't outrun them, but we can outsmart them." Eliza climbed into the wagon, girls beside her. "Where are we headed?" "To the crossing." "The canyon trail?" He nodded. "They can't follow us narrow there. But it'll be close." She didn't argue. She trusted him now, in that unspoken way that came when someone had stood between you and fire, and hadn't flinched. The ride was rough. Ruts deep. Ice still clinging to the grass. The wagon wheels bounced over frozen mud and dried roots. Samuel rode ahead on horseback, scanning the horizon, hand never straying far from his rifle. Behind them the sound came, hoofbeats distant but gaining. Eliza glanced back, heart seizing. The riders were there. 5 shadows galloping through dust, one holding something long and gleaming. "They've seen us," she said. Samuel didn't look back. "Let them. That's part of it." He veered left, guiding them through a rocky incline where the trail narrowed and climbed. "This way. Stay close to the wall." Branches scraped the sides of the wagon. The mule wheezed from the climb. May clung to her mother's arm. Ruth held a small knife Samuel had given her, though she barely knew how to grip it. The first gunshot cracked through the canyon like thunder. Eliza ducked low over the girls, heart pounding in her ears. Samuel turned his horse sharp, returned fire. One of the riders reeled back, horse bucking sideways. "For left," he called out. They reached a narrow bend where the canyon wall curved hard. The river roared below, a steep drop but shallow enough to cross on foot if they had to. Samuel dismounted. "We'll make our stand here." Eliza jumped down, grabbing the rifle from the wagon. "They'll pin us," she said. "We've got no cover." "They'll think that. Until they're in range." He handed her a wrapped bundle from the saddlebag, dynamite sticks. Eliza stared. "Where the hell?" "Mining days. Kept them dry." She took one. "You plan on throwing this?" "I plan on ending this." The first of the Bishop boys came too fast, riding high with a pistol raised and a mouth full of victory. Samuel fired once. The man jerked back like pulled by a string and fell from the saddle. 3 left. Gunfire cracked again. A bullet splintered a rock inches from Eliza's shoulder. Ruth screamed but didn't run. She dropped behind the wagon, pulling May down with her. "Stay low," Eliza shouted. One of the riders dismounted and began flanking. Samuel saw it too late. Eliza moved. Fast. No hesitation. She slid along the edge of the canyon, aimed and pulled the trigger. The man dropped. 2 left. But one had already reached the top of the ridge. Dirk Bishop himself, teeth clenched around a cigar, rifle aimed straight at Samuel's chest. "You always were the quiet type, Hayes," he growled, spitting the cigar out. "Guess I'll quiet you for good." Samuel turned, but not fast enough. The shot rang out. But it wasn't Dirk's rifle that fired. It was Ruth. The shot was wild, but close enough to make Dirk duck and curse. It gave Samuel the second he needed. He rolled, fired once, and Dirk's leg gave out beneath him. The outlaw screamed, tumbled backward, and over the edge. They heard the splash below. The last rider turned and fled. Silence fell. Not the kind of silence that comes from absence, but the kind that comes from survival. From blood cooling in the dust. From breath held too long and finally exhaled. Eliza dropped the rifle. Her hands were shaking. Samuel sat back against a boulder, clutching his shoulder. A grazing wound, but deep enough to bleed. "You're hurt," she said. He smiled faintly. "Just enough to remember I'm still alive." Ruth stepped out from behind the wagon, the small pistol in her hand still trembling. Eliza rushed to her. Where did you?" "He gave it to me," Ruth said, voice hollow. "In case you couldn't stop them." Eliza pulled her into a hug so tight Ruth whimpered. But she didn't let go. Samuel stood slowly, eyes scanning the trail. That's the end of them. For now, Eliza said. No, I mean it. The bishop line's broken. His brothers were cowards. They won't come back. Not after this. He looked down at the canyon. Blood at the crossing, he murmured. Just like my wife. Eliza looked up at him. What do you mean? He didn't speak for a long time. Then, the same river. Years ago. We tried to make it through a flash flood. Lost the wagon. Lost her. Lost the girl. Eliza's throat closed. And you came back here anyway? I didn't. Not until I saw you on that platform. She reached for his hand. He let her take it. You think it's over? She asked. No, he said. But I think it's changing. They buried the dead near the river, marked the graves with stones. No names. Just silence. On the way back, the girls sat in the wagon, heads resting on one another. The wind was colder now and the sky heavy with dusk. Eliza sat beside Samuel. His sleeve was blood-soaked, but his face was clear. You saved us, she said. He shook his head. You saved yourselves. I just bought you time. You risked your life. So did you. She looked at him. Are we free now? He didn't answer. But the land looked different. Quieter. The kind of quiet earned, not given. When they reached the ranch, the scorched barn stood like a scar, but they didn't look at it the same way anymore. Eliza stepped down, helped Ruth and May out, then turned to Samuel. Come inside, she said softly. He hesitated, then followed. The fire was already lit. The girls curled up near it. Eliza brought out coffee. No sugar. No milk. Just warmth. They drank in silence. When the fire cracked, Eliza turned. You know, she said, a man once told me grief tries to dress itself in rage, but that it isn't stronger. Samuel met her eyes. And what is? She smiled. The will to stay. The morning after the canyon crossing, the world looked rebuilt. Not repaired, there was still ash in the fields and blood in the riverbed, but the fear that once curled around Eliza's ribs like wire had finally loosened. She stood by the fence post, watching the girls race across the frost-laced grass, their laughter rising like birds into the cold blue. Ruth chased May in a slow circle, hair flying, cheeks pink with life. There was something new in Ruth's stride, confidence, not hardened but tempered. Eliza had seen her daughter look over her shoulder every day for a year. Now she didn't. Samuel stood a few yards off, arms folded, left shoulder still stiff from the wound, his expression unreadable. They're lighter today, she said. He nodded without taking his eyes off the girls. They earned it. She glanced toward the barn's charred skeleton. We all did. Word spread faster than wildfire in a town starved for gossip. By midweek, every saloon, stable, and church pew echoed with the same whispered tale. Bishop was gone, the outlaw line broken by a widowed woman and a rancher with no taste for crowds. Some said the sheriff finally grew a spine. Others said God had. Sheriff Callum rode out to the ranch that Friday with a paper in hand and sweat on his brow. He dismounted without speaking, handed the folded document to Eliza, and removed his hat. She unfolded it. A formal decree. Her name. Her land. Full rights restored. I thought the law wasn't on my side, she said. Callum glanced at Samuel. Turns out, sometimes it just needs a shove. He rode off without asking for coffee or pleasantries. Eliza watched him go. That's not a man used to losing. No, Samuel said. But maybe he's tired of backing the wrong side. The next week, the preacher came. He brought building supplies and 2 young men to help rebuild the barn. He didn't say much, just rolled up his sleeves and hammered planks with a kind of penance. May made them lemonade with wild mint and too much water, and Ruth tried to learn how to use a handsaw without taking off a finger. Samuel let her. They worked together in a rhythm that felt like healing. Dust and sweat. Timber and laughter. In the evenings, they sat on the porch and watched the sunset paint the sky in copper streaks. It was Ruth who said it first. You should stay, Mr. Hayes. He looked at her, startled. I live here. She shook her head. Not just live. Stay. With us. May added, you're already part of the family. Eliza didn't speak right away. Her hands rested on her lap, fingers twined. We don't have much, she said, voice quiet. You have more than most, he replied. You still keep your wife's ring on that beam. Samuel turned his eyes to the doorframe, where the gold band hung like a quiet memory. I do. Does that mean there's no room for anyone else? He didn't answer for a long time. Then, with great care, he rose, walked to the beam, and took the ring down. He held it in his palm a moment. Then he placed it in a wooden box, shut the lid and set it on the mantel. "I'll never forget her," he said. "But maybe remembering doesn't have to mean stopping." Eliza stood. "I don't want someone to fix my life. I don't want to be someone's redemption. I don't want to be needed," she said. "I just want to be chosen." Samuel stepped close. "Then let me choose you." The air shifted. Not dramatic. Not thunderous. Just something small and undeniable, like the way fire starts from a single ember. Eliza reached out, took his hand and didn't let go. On the first day of spring, the town held a gathering. A new barn now stood behind Samuel's house, sturdy and wide. The townsfolk brought food, music and hesitant goodwill. The preacher blessed the harvest. The blacksmith's daughter brought wildflowers. No one spoke of the fire. Or the blood. But they all looked at Eliza differently now. As someone who had stood on an auction block, and climbed back down on her own terms. Ruth wore a blue ribbon in her hair. May clutched a carved wooden bird Samuel had made her. They didn't flinch when people looked their way. They smiled. Eliza stood near the door, dress pressed, face clean, back straight. A young woman approached her with trembling lips and eyes too familiar. "They're still threatening women," the girl said. "In the back rooms. With paper and promises." Eliza met her gaze. "Then we don't run anymore." The girl blinked. "We. All of us," Eliza said. "Every last one." That night, after the guests had gone and the lanterns were doused, Samuel and Eliza stood on the porch, the prairie stretching wide before them. "You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't stepped forward that day?" she asked. "All the time." "What do you see?" He shook his head. "Nothing I'd want to live with." She leaned against him, resting her head on his uninjured shoulder. "You didn't just set them free," she said. "No. You set me free too." And as the wind moved across the tall grass like a lullaby, Eliza closed her eyes and let herself believe something she hadn't dared in years. That a woman could be broken and still be worth choosing. That daughters could be stolen from a platform and still end up laughing in the sun. That sometimes the quietest men carry the fiercest kind of love. And that maybe, just maybe, when the world writes you off, it's not the end of the story. Sometimes it's the part where you stop surviving and start living.